She called her the Hun Nun. Said it with a smile, probably. The Queen Mother had a gift for that, cruelty dressed up as wit. The woman she mocked was Princess Alice of Battenberg, mother of Prince Philip. And here's the thing that makes this genuinely absurd. Princess Alice was the great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria herself. The Queen Mother? Scottish aristocracy, respectable, old money, but technically a commoner. The first to marry a king's son in centuries. So when Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon sneered at Princess Alice's German ancestry and her religious vocation, she was punching up. Way up. She just didn't see it that way. This is the story of the Queen Mother's most treasured grievances, the ones she nursed for decades, the ones that shaped her entire identity, and how every single one of them collapses the moment you look at the actual facts. She blamed a dead man for her husband's death while ignoring what was actually killing him. She treated a war hero like an embarrassment, and she built a reputation for charm that's now being dismantled, one uncomfortable truth at a time. Let's start with blood, because to the Queen Mother, blood mattered enormously. Princess Victoria Alice Elizabeth Julia Marie of Battenberg was born on the 25th of February 1885 at Windsor Castle. Queen Victoria was there, actually present in the room, watching her great-granddaughter enter the world. The infant's mother was Princess Victoria of Hesse and by Rhine, whose own mother was Princess Alice of the United Kingdom, Queen Victoria's second daughter. That's a straight line, great-grandmother to great-granddaughter, royal blood through the female line, undiluted by any morganatic marriage on the maternal side. The baby was born deaf. No one realized it for 8 years. 8 years of confusion about why this otherwise bright child struggled to learn to speak. Once her condition was finally diagnosed, her mother taught her to lip read. Princess Alice developed this skill with such extraordinary proficiency that she could eventually read lips fluently in 4 languages: English, German, French, and Greek. Many people who met her throughout her life never realized she couldn't hear them at all. She'd watch conversations across crowded rooms that others assumed were private. The disability became, in certain circumstances, an advantage. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was born 15 years later, on the 4th of August, 1900. The location? Disputed. Either a London townhouse or Glamis Castle in Scotland. The family never quite settled on a consistent story, which is odd for people who cared so much about lineage. Her father was the 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn, Scottish nobility, ancient lineage, castles and titles and all the rest. But here's what they didn't have: any direct connection to Queen Victoria, or to any reigning monarch in Europe. While the Bowes-Lyons could trace distant ancestry to Robert II of Scotland if they squinted hard enough at the family tree, this wasn't the kind of royal blood that mattered in early 20th century Europe. When Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon married Prince Albert, Duke of York, on the 26th of April, 1923, she became the first commoner to marry a king's son in centuries. The newspapers said so at the time. Her elevation to royalty came entirely from the wedding ring on her finger, not from her birth. Princess Alice outranked her by blood, always had, always would. And yet, it was the Queen Mother who acted like she was the guardian of royal standards, who worried about Princess Alice showing up in a nun's habit, who reportedly used that phrase, the Hun Nun, to describe a woman who'd hidden Jewish families from the Gestapo, while the Queen Mother was safely guarded at Buckingham Palace. The hypocrisy is structural. It's built into the foundation. Princess Alice's wedding, by the way, was the kind of event the Queen Mother could never have claimed. On the 7th of October, 1903, Princess Alice married Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark at Darmstadt. The guest list read like a roll call of European royalty. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia attended with his wife Alexandra, who was Princess Alice's aunt. Prince Andrew was the seventh child of King George I of Greece, making the marriage a union between two royal houses. This was how royalty married royalty in the era before the First World War. Cousins and second cousins, interconnected bloodlines stretching across every throne from London to St. Petersburg. Princess Alice's trajectory from that gilded wedding day would be anything but smooth. Greek politics were volatile, torn between republican movements and monarchist factions, complicated by wars and revolutions. The royal family faced repeated exile. Prince Andrew was arrested in 1922, following a catastrophic military defeat, put on trial, convicted, and nearly executed. Only the intervention of King George V of Britain saved his life. George V sent a Royal Navy cruiser, HMS Calypso, to extract the family. They fled Greece with virtually nothing. Prince Philip, 18 months old, was reportedly carried aboard in a makeshift crib fashioned from an orange crate. This was the family background that the Queen Mother apparently found embarrassing. Exiled royalty. A mother who'd been institutionalized. Foreign. Complicated. Not the kind of clean, respectable lineage that looked good in photographs. Now, the abdication. The Queen Mother blamed Edward VIII for everything. Everything. Her husband's stress, her family's loss of privacy, the weight of constitutional duties that crushed George VI's health. She nursed the grudge for 66 years. Refused to receive Wallis Simpson at court until Wallis's death in 1986, and maintained the hatred beyond the grave. She worked to ensure Wallis was denied the title Her Royal Highness, which meant courtiers weren't required to curtsy to her. A deliberate humiliation. A daily reminder of diminished status. And the narrative she constructed went like this. Edward selfishly abandoned his duty for love, forcing his shy, stammering brother onto a throne he never wanted, and the stress of that burden killed him. It's a good story, sympathetic. It makes her the wronged wife, the loyal supporter, the woman who lost her husband to someone else's selfishness. There's just one problem. George VI was already a 3-pack-a-day smoker before Edward abdicated. Let's be specific about this because the specificity matters. Prince Albert, the future George VI, began smoking as a naval cadet at Osborne and Dartmouth. That's his teenage years. He entered naval training in 1909 when he was 13 years old. Naval cadets in the early 20th century commonly picked up tobacco habits during military training, and Albert was no exception. His father, King George V, was a heavy smoker. His grandfather, King Edward VII, died of smoking-related illness in 1910. The family tradition was emphysema as much as it was monarchy. By the time the abdication crisis hit in December 1936, Albert had been smoking heavily for more than 20 years. 20 years. The cigarettes came first. The crown came second. Albert was 36 when he became king. He'd been smoking since he was a teenager. The abdication didn't introduce tobacco into his life. It had been there for 2 decades already. When George VI developed a severe arterial blockage in his right leg in March 1949, doctors diagnosed arteriosclerosis and Buerger's disease, also known as thromboangiitis obliterans. Both conditions are overwhelmingly associated with heavy tobacco use. He underwent a right lumbar sympathectomy, a surgical procedure to improve blood flow by severing certain nerves to save the leg from amputation. A contemporary bulletin from Time magazine noted that smoking constricts the small arteries and reported that doctors had ordered the king to cease heavy smoking. The disease failed to respond to treatment. George VI kept smoking anyway. How much? 40 to 50 cigarettes per day. Some sources say 60. A 3-pack-a-day man. every single day. 5 times what modern health guidelines consider heavy smoking. He continued, despite explicit medical advice, that tobacco was destroying his circulatory system. His doctors told him to stop. He didn't. In September 1951, George VI underwent a total left pneumonectomy. That means they removed his entire left lung. The reason the royal household gave was vague: structural abnormalities, but the reality was lung cancer. He died 4 months later, on the 6th of February 1952. He was 56 years old. The Queen Mother blamed the abdication. The Queen Mother did not, apparently, blame the 40 to 50 cigarettes her husband smoked every single day in their shared home. The cigarettes she watched him light for decades. The smoke that filled their rooms. Someone in Yorkshire catches a cold, the Queen Mother. Blame the abdication. Her husband develops lung cancer after 3.5 decades of chain smoking, the abdication. Now look, I want to be fair here. The abdication was a big deal. It genuinely was. Edward VIII announced his decision on the 11th of December 1936 in a radio broadcast that stunned the nation. Overnight, everything changed for the Duke and Duchess of York. The constitutional duties were enormous. The public pressure was intense. George VI had to rebuild confidence in the monarchy at a time when war with Nazi Germany was clearly coming. Within 3 years, Britain would be fighting for survival. The famous speech therapy he undertook with Lionel Logue wasn't vanity. It was survival. A king who couldn't address his nation during wartime would have been a catastrophe. His stammer had caused him profound embarrassment his entire life. Now, the whole world would hear every hesitation. The stress was real. The loss of privacy was real. The damage to the monarchy's reputation was real. And George VI and his family had to repair it through constant public engagement. But stress doesn't cause lung cancer. Cigarettes do. The Queen Mother's narrative required ignoring the most obvious cause of her husband's death in favor of one that served her emotionally. Edward VIII made a convenient villain. He was already disgraced. He'd chosen Wallace Simpson over duty. Blaming him cost her nothing and gave her a lifetime of righteous grievance. The cigarettes were harder to blame. They were in her own home. She watched him smoke them. For decades. To blame the cigarettes would be to admit that she'd watched her husband kill himself slowly, 1 cigarette at a time, and done nothing. Or at least, nothing effective. So she didn't mention them. While the Queen Mother was perfecting her grievance narrative, Princess Alice was living through something that makes complaints about stress look obscene. The year 1930 had brought catastrophe. Following what would now be recognized as a severe mental health crisis, Princess Alice was diagnosed with schizophrenia by the leading psychiatrists of the era. She was committed against her will to Dr. Ludwig Binswanger's clinic at Kreuzlingen in Switzerland. The treatments she received were brutal by modern standards, experimental procedures that contemporary medicine has long since abandoned. But here's the detail that really needs to sink in. Sigmund Freud himself was consulted about her case. The father of psychoanalysis examined Princess Alice's condition and concluded that her religious fervor and mystical experiences were symptoms of sexual frustration. His recommendation? X-ray her ovaries. The theory, if you can call it that, was that irradiating her reproductive organs would reduce her libido and thereby cure her schizophrenia. Princess Alice was subjected to this procedure. They bombarded her ovaries with radiation in an attempt to make her less spiritual. It didn't work, obviously, because the premise was insane. But that's what passed for cutting-edge psychiatric treatment in 1930, and that's what Princess Alice endured. Forced sterilization through radiation, based on Freud's theory that her devotion to God was actually repressed sexual desire. She was separated from her husband and all 5 of her children. Prince Andrew effectively abandoned her during this period. He moved to Monte Carlo, where he lived with a mistress. Her 4 daughters had already married into German noble families, dispersing across Europe, marriages that would become politically toxic once war broke out. Her young son Philip was sent to live with relatives in England, primarily under the care of his maternal grandmother and his uncle, Lord Louis Mountbatten. He was 9 years old when his mother was institutionalized. He wouldn't live with her again for years. Princess Alice would spend years in institutional care before eventually recovering. Recovering, mind you, without any help from the radiation treatments or the Freudian interventions. She simply got better, slowly, on her own timeline. She returned to Greece in 1938, after a long period of separation from her homeland. Her circumstances were modest. She had little money. She lived simply in a small apartment in Athens. Meanwhile, the Duchess of York was living at 145 Piccadilly, with a full household staff, planning dinner parties and shopping for hats. The contrast isn't subtle. Then the Nazis arrived. The German invasion of Greece began in April 1941. The Greek royal family fled to Egypt. Princess Alice stayed. She threw herself into charitable work with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Soup kitchens for the starving population, medical supplies smuggled through Red Cross and Swedish Red Cross connections. The work drew Gestapo attention. A foreign princess, connected to the British royal family, engaging in extensive charitable operations under Nazi occupation? They noticed. In 1943, Himaki Cohen died. He'd been a member of the Greek parliament, a successful businessman, a longtime friend of the Greek royal family going back to his support for King George I. His widow Rachel and their children faced what virtually every Jew in occupied Greece faced: deportation to the death camps. The Jewish community of Thessaloniki had numbered approximately 50,000 people before the war. By the end of the occupation, more than 80% of Greek Jews would be murdered. Princess Alice opened her home to Rachel Cohen and her daughter Tilda. For 13 months, from 1943 until the liberation of Greece in October 1944, she hid them in an apartment within her Athens residence. 3 of Rachel's adult sons managed to escape Greece separately, reaching Egypt via Turkey, where they survived the war. The daughter Tilda remained hidden with her mother, dependent entirely on Princess Alice's protection and discretion. The risk was direct and personal. Athens, under Nazi occupation, was a city of informers. Neighbors watched each other. Denunciations were common, sometimes for money, sometimes for political advantage, sometimes for no reason at all. Any tip, any suspicious observation, could bring investigators to the door. The Gestapo came. They demanded to know who was living upstairs. Princess Alice weaponized her disability. She was deaf, had been since birth, and she played it up. She pretended not to understand their questions. She made them repeat themselves. She acted confused, bewildered, slightly dim. She claimed simply that a nanny lived with her, nothing more. They accepted the explanation and left. She kept hiding the Cohens for months after that encounter, 13 months total. Rachel and Tilda survived the war because of her, because a deaf princess with no money and no power and a history of mental illness decided to risk everything for people the Nazis wanted dead. During the same 13 months that Princess Alice was hiding Jewish refugees from the Gestapo, Queen Elizabeth was continuing her wartime routine in London. And to be fair, she did important work. Buckingham Palace was bombed on the 13th of September 1940. 9 German bombs hit the palace, destroying the royal chapel and causing significant damage to the north wing. The king and queen were in residence at the time. Queen Elizabeth famously declared that she could now look the East End in the face, acknowledging that ordinary Londoners who had lost their homes to German bombs might have resented a queen who fled to safety while they suffered. She visited bombed areas throughout the war, met with the injured and displaced, projected calm determination. The British public's affection for her during this period was genuine and well-earned. But she was never interrogated by the Gestapo, never had to decide in a single moment whether to hand over refugees or lie to men who could have her arrested. Never went to bed knowing that a knock on the door might mean death for herself and the people hiding upstairs. Different wars, different risks. So, wedding day. 20th of November, 1947. Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip at Westminster Abbey. A moment of national celebration in an era of post-war austerity. Ration coupons were still required for the bride's dress, and the government granted her extra allocations so it would be appropriately magnificent. Royalty from across Europe attended, dignitaries, politicians, and, necessarily, the mother of the groom. But not the groom's sisters. This is where it gets complicated, and where you can almost understand the Queen Mother's anxiety. Almost. Princess Alice had 4 daughters, Margarita, Theodora, Cecilia, and Sophie. They'd all married German princes and aristocrats in the years before the war. Cecilia had died tragically in 1937 in a plane crash that killed her husband, her 2 young sons, and her mother-in-law. But the surviving 3 sisters posed a political problem in 1947. Their husbands had served in the German military, and Sophie's husband, Prince Christoph of Hesse, had been a high-ranking member of the SS, not just a soldier. SS, the organization responsible for implementing the Holocaust. Christoph had died in 1943, but the association remained. After the war, with anti-German sentiment still raw, with the memory of the Blitz still fresh, Philip's sisters were not invited. The politics were impossible. No one wanted photographs of the future queen's wedding that included women whose husbands had worn Nazi uniforms. Philip stood at the altar without a single member of his immediate family present except his mother. And here's the thing. The decision to exclude the sisters was defensible, probably necessary. The optics would have been catastrophic. But the Queen Mother's hostility extended far beyond political prudence. She didn't just exclude the sisters with the problematic husbands. She looked down on the entire Battenberg Mountbatten clan as unsuitable. She called Philip the Hun to his face. She reportedly tried to prevent the marriage entirely, or at least to delay it. She thought her daughter could do better than this penniless foreign prince, with the institutionalized mother and the Nazi-adjacent sisters. The irony, of course, is that the Hun had more royal blood than she did, and his mother, the institutionalized one, had risked her life to save Jews from the very Nazis whose uniforms the Queen Mother found so contaminating. According to multiple biographers, including Hugo Vickers, who wrote the most comprehensive account of Princess Alice's life, Queen Elizabeth was anxious about even Princess Alice's attendance. Specifically, she worried about Princess Alice's intended attire. Princess Alice had devoted herself to religious life. She'd founded the Christian Sisterhood of Martha and Mary, a Greek Orthodox nursing order inspired by her aunt, Grand Duchess Elizabeth Fyodorovna of Russia, who was murdered by the Bolsheviks in 1918. She regularly wore the habit. The Queen was understandably terrified, that's the phrase biographers use, that Princess Andrew would show up at the wedding at Westminster Abbey wearing her nun's habit and embarrassing the family. Embarrassing the family. This woman had hidden Jews from the Gestapo, had pretended to be more deaf than she was to protect refugees in her own home, had risked arrest and worse for 13 months, had watched her daughter's invitations revoked because of their German marriages, had seen her husband abandon her, her children scattered, her wealth evaporate, her mental health collapse and slowly rebuild, had survived Freud's recommended radiation treatments, and the Queen Mother was worried about what she'd wear to the wedding. The message was conveyed. Princess Alice complied. She attended her son's wedding in a simple silk dress and hat, instead of her religious habit. The Queen later described the outfit as very pretty and most appropriate. Very pretty. Most appropriate. The language of conditional approval. The kind of compliment that carries the weight of prior anxiety, relief that the embarrassment had been avoided. Princess Alice was present for the official photographs. She sat with the other guests. She wasn't excluded from the event itself. But her religious devotion, the vocation she'd taken up after years of suffering and loss, the order she'd founded to honor her martyred aunt, was treated as a potential embarrassment rather than a source of respect. The hostility between the Queen Mother and Prince Philip didn't end at the wedding. It continued for years. When George VI died in 1952 and Elizabeth became queen, a battle erupted over something that might seem trivial but wasn't: the family name. Prince Philip wanted his children to bear his name, Mountbatten. He was the Duke of Edinburgh, the husband of the sovereign, and by the conventions of British naming, his children should have been Mountbattens. The Queen Mother and Winston Churchill fought this viciously. They insisted the children must remain Windsors. Philip, reportedly, was devastated. He complained that he was the only man in the country not allowed to give his name to his own children. The Queen Mother won. The royal house remained Windsor. Philip's name was erased from his own family. This was the woman who called Princess Alice the Hun Nun, who called Philip the Hun, who treated the Mountbattens as foreign interlopers, despite the fact that they'd anglicized their names specifically to prove their British loyalty during the First World War, the exact opposite of disloyalty. Lord Louis Mountbatten had been a war hero. Prince Philip had served with distinction in the Royal Navy against Germany. Princess Alice had hidden Jews from the Gestapo. None of it mattered. They were foreign. They were complicated. They weren't the right sort. The Hun Nun. Hun for her German Battenberg connections. Never mind that the Mountbattens had been British for decades. The family had changed their name from Battenberg during the First World War, specifically to avoid anti-German sentiment. Never mind that Philip had served in the Royal Navy against Germany, seen action in the Mediterranean and the Pacific. Never mind that Princess Alice's great-grandmother was Queen Victoria herself, who was hardly an enemy alien. Nun for her religious vocation. Never mind what she'd done while wearing that habit. Never mind the refugees she'd hidden, the Gestapo she'd deceived, the lives she'd saved. The phrase captured a particular kind of snobbery, contempt for ancestry and faith, delivered in a single dismissive quip. The Queen Mother was famously witty. People loved her charm. This was part of that charm, cruelty that sounded like cleverness. Princess Alice didn't have the option of returning fire. She was deaf, dependent on lip-reading in crowded rooms, always slightly on the outside of conversations that others assumed were private, even though she might be reading every word from across the room. She was poor. The Greek Civil War and years of exile had left her with nothing. She was foreign in a way that British society would never quite forgive. And her mental health history made her vulnerable to dismissal. People who've been institutionalized rarely get the benefit of the doubt. The Queen Mother, meanwhile, had Clarence House, had staff and guards and a reputation for elegance, had a lifestyle that far exceeded what her official income could support. Let's talk about that lifestyle for a moment. The Queen Mother's spending was legendary within royal circles, and not in a flattering way. She maintained a household staff that reportedly numbered around 50 people at Clarence House. Her wine cellar was famously extensive. Her preferred drink, gin and Dubonnet, became so associated with her that it's still called the Queen Mother's cocktail. She entertained lavishly. She bought art. She purchased the Castle of May in Scotland and spent years restoring it as a holiday home. All of this was funded primarily by the Civil List, the government allowance paid to working members of the royal family. But the civil list wasn't enough. The Queen Mother consistently spent more than her income. When she died in 2002, she was reportedly millions of pounds in overdraft. Some estimates suggested £4 million or more in debt. The debt was quietly settled from her estate, which included valuable art and property. But the fact remained. She'd lived for decades beyond her means, subsidized by the public purse and supplemented by overdrafts that an ordinary citizen could never have obtained. The nun who hid Jews from the Gestapo lived in a small Athens apartment with no money. The socialite with the gin bill died millions in debt. History eventually sorts these things out. George VI died on the 6th of February 1952. He was 56 years old. His daughter Elizabeth became Queen Elizabeth II at 25. For the next 50 years, the Queen Mother perfected her public image. The charm, the hats, the waves, the carefully constructed impression of a beloved grandmother figure who'd suffered through abdication and war and emerged graceful and unbroken. She bought the Castle of May in Caithness, Scotland, a romantic ruin she restored as a holiday home. She cultivated journalists and biographers. She smiled for every photograph. She also maintained her grudges. Edward VIII was never forgiven. Wallis Simpson was never received. The narrative of victimhood was never revised. And the Mountbattens remained, in her view, not quite acceptable. She outlived Princess Alice by 33 years. Princess Alice died in December 1969. Relatively obscure, her wartime heroism largely unknown to the British public. She'd spent her final years living at Buckingham Palace, at the invitation of her daughter-in-law, Queen Elizabeth II. A quiet acknowledgement, perhaps, that she deserved better than she'd received. But death doesn't end the story. Sometimes it's just where the reassessment begins. In 1988, Princess Alice's remains were moved from Windsor to the Church of Mary Magdalene in Gethsemane, on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. She'd asked to be buried near her aunt Elizabeth Fyodorovna, the Russian Grand Duchess who'd inspired her religious order, who'd been murdered by the Bolsheviks and eventually canonized as a saint. The request was honored decades after her death. It took that long to arrange. 5 years later, in 1993, Yad Vashem, Israel's national Holocaust memorial, bestowed on Princess Alice the title of Righteous Among the Nations. The honor recognizes non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. Only a few thousand people in history have received it. A year after that, in 1994, Prince Philip visited Yad Vashem. He stood in the Hall of Names. He honored his mother's courage publicly, decades after her death, in a way that would have been unthinkable while she was alive and marginalized by the British establishment. In 2018, Prince William attended a ceremony when a new plaque honoring Princess Alice was unveiled. Her great-grandson, representing the future of the British monarchy, formally acknowledged what the Queen Mother had spent decades ignoring. Princess Alice of Battenberg was a hero. Princess Alice, the Hun Nun, the embarrassment, the woman whose clothing choices caused anxiety at Westminster Abbey, is now commemorated alongside Oskar Schindler and Raoul Wallenberg. Her name is inscribed in Jerusalem. The Queen Mother's name is inscribed at Windsor, in the memorial chapel where George VI is also buried. The chapel includes no mention of the cigarettes. Here's the thing about the Queen Mother's grievances. They only work if you don't examine them. Blame the abdication for George VI's death, and you can position yourself as the wronged widow for 6 decades. But look at the medical records. The arterial blockage in 1949, the Berger's disease, the lung cancer, the pneumonectomy that removed an entire lung, the 40 to 50 cigarettes every single day. And the narrative falls apart. Edward VIII didn't kill George VI. Tobacco did. The abdication added stress to a life already being shortened by addiction. Mock Princess Alice as a Hun and a Nun, and you can feel superior to your son-in-law's difficult foreign mother. But look at the genealogy. Queen Victoria's great-granddaughter versus a Scottish earl's 9th child, and the snobbery reverses itself. The Queen Mother was the commoner who'd married in. Princess Alice was the one with royal blood. The hierarchy of birth that the Queen Mother pretended to protect actually placed her below the woman she mocked. And compare their war records, hiding refugees from the Gestapo versus touring bombed neighborhoods with a security detail, and the moral hierarchy becomes unmistakable. One woman risked her life for strangers the Nazis wanted dead. One woman built a reputation for charm. Shows like The Crown have started telling some of these stories. Audiences are discovering the version of the Queen Mother that biographers have known for years. Petty, vindictive, extravagant, and absolutely certain of her own righteousness. The hagiography is eroding. People are asking questions they didn't ask before. Meanwhile, Princess Alice is finally getting her due. The woman who was treated as an embarrassment is now recognized as a hero. The woman who worried about that embarrassment is being reassessed as something less flattering. Queen Elizabeth II turned out remarkably well. Steady, dedicated, unpretentious compared to the women who raised her. She navigated her mother's influence, her grandmother Queen Mary's rigidity, and emerged with a sense of duty that outlasted both of them. She didn't inherit her mother's grudges or her grandmother's coldness. She figured out a different way to be royal. She invited Princess Alice to live at Buckingham Palace in her final years. She honored her memory. She treated her husband's mother with more respect than her own mother ever had. She eventually allowed her children to use Mountbatten Windsor as a surname in certain contexts. A quiet correction of the battle her mother had won decades earlier. But that's its own kind of testimony, isn't it? She became the queen she was despite the women around her, not because of them. Princess Alice of Battenberg deserves the last word. She was born into royalty at Windsor Castle, with Queen Victoria watching. She survived exile and revolution, escaped Greece in a warship while her infant son slept in an orange crate. She endured years of institutionalized treatment for mental illness, including Freud's recommended radiation of her ovaries. She was abandoned by her husband, separated from her children. She lost her daughters to marriages across Europe that made them untouchable after the war. She lost Cecilia entirely, killed in a plane crash in 1937, along with her husband and children. She returned to a country under Nazi occupation and actively chose, to hide Jewish families in her home at the risk of her own life. She lied to the Gestapo's faces, pretending to be more disabled than she was, buying time for the refugees upstairs. She founded a religious order. She wore the habit. She was mocked for it by a woman with less royal blood and less courage, and considerably more debt. And now, her name is inscribed at Yad Vashem, recognized by the State of Israel, honored in Jerusalem alongside the greatest heroes of Holocaust rescue. The Queen Mother's name is on a gin glass somewhere. History knows the difference. Subscribe for more stories like this.